The wind, a constant, abrasive whisper across the ochre plains, was my only true companion out here. It hummed through the skeletal dish of the radio observatory, a metallic lament that often merged with the low thrum of the cooling systems. For years, this isolated bastion of steel and silicon, miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, had been my sanctuary, my prison, my everything. My days bled into nights in a seamless continuum of data streams, spectral analyses, and the silent, hungry gaze into the abyssal tapestry above. My life was a precise calibration, a ritual of solitude. Each day, the universe presented its usual, predictable grandeur. Until it didn't. My fingers, accustomed to the cool, worn keys of the console, paused over the input. A spike, barely perceptible, on a frequency band that should have been utterly barren. I dismissed it, at first, as equipment chatter, a transient glitch in the vast, intricate network of receivers. But the ghost returned. The following night, under a sky so clear the Milky Way was a river of powdered diamonds, the anomaly solidified. It wasn't a spike, it was a pattern. A complex, repeating sequence that defied all known astrophysical phenomena. My breath hitched. This wasn't a star collapsing, nor a pulsar's rhythmic beat, nor the afterglow of a primordial explosion. This was structured, deliberate. The pattern unfurled itself across the screen, a tessellation of data points that, with each iteration, grew more intricate, more impossibly ordered. It was as if the fabric of random noise had been meticulously rewoven into a tapestry of alien intent. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and empirical reasoning, struggled to categorize it. It was like staring at a perfect snowflake and realizing it was made of interlocking gears. The coordinates of its origin point flashed, an impossible vector, beyond the observable universe. How could a signal, any signal, traverse such a distance, from a point that, by all current understanding, should not even exist within our cosmic horizon? I spent the next 3 days in a feverish blur, existing solely on lukewarm coffee and the adrenaline of the incomprehensible. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. My world shrank to the glowing screens, the rhythmic hum of the machinery, and the relentless unfolding of the signal. I ran every diagnostic, cross-referenced every database, recalibrated every sensor. Each test returned the same maddening, impossible truth. The signal was real. And it was coming from beyond. My colleague, the only other soul within a 100-mile radius, a quiet technician named Ilara, noticed my shift. He'd bring me stale sandwiches, his gaze a mixture of concern and a weary understanding of my obsessive nature. "Anything, Raj?" he'd ask, his voice a soft counterpoint to the machine drone. I would only shake my head, unable to articulate the growing unease that gnawed me. How could I explain that the universe had just winked at me from a place that wasn't there? The signal was not merely complex, it was intelligent. Its patterns seemed to adapt, to subtly shift, as if responding to my attempts to dissect it. It wasn't a broadcast, it felt more like an infinitely intricate puzzle, each piece fitting into a larger, terrifyingly coherent whole. The data streamed in, a river of alien logic, carving new channels in my understanding of reality. I found myself staring at the display, not as a scientist analyzing data, but as someone confronted by an impossible, ancient text. Each pulse, each frequency shift, seemed to carry a weight, a meaning that hovered just beyond the grasp of human cognition. It wasn't just information, it was information that seemed to redefine the very space it occupied. The numbers on the screen began to blur, not from fatigue, but from a subtle, sickening sensation that the dimensions they represented were twisting. A profound loneliness settled over me, deeper than any isolation I had ever known in this remote outpost. The tension in the air was palpable, a static charge building. Not just in the metal dishes outside, but deep within my own skull. And something within me, something fundamental, felt as if it were beginning to fray. The metallic lament of the wind, a constant, abrasive whisper, still hummed through the skeletal dish of the radio observatory, a sound that now seemed less a companion and more a prelude. I sat hunched over the main console, the cooling system's low thrum a rhythmic counterpoint to the rapid tap of my fingers across the holographic interface. Screens glowed, painting my face in shifting hues of sapphire and emerald as I parsed the raw data stream. Hours had blurred into an endless present, my determination a singular, sharp point in the vast, quiet expanse of the control room. My initial excitement, a potent brew of scientific curiosity and the thrill of the unknown, still coursed through me, though it was beginning to curdle into something less pure. The signal. I had run every filter, every algorithm known to modern astrophysics. I'd tried Fourier transforms, wavelets, correlation functions. Each attempt met with the same baffling result. The patterns defied conventional decomposition. They weren't random noise, the intricate symmetries, the recurring motifs within the seemingly chaotic data, screamed intelligence. Yet, they refused to conform to any discernible linguistic or mathematical structure I understood. I watched a spectrogram scroll, a vibrant aurora of frequencies across the display. Normally, stellar emissions, pulsars, or even cosmic background radiation would leave predictable signatures, spikes, bands, gentle curves, but this was a labyrinthine tapestry woven from impossible threads. Frequencies would appear, then vanish, only to re-emerge several octaves higher, distorted, as if viewed through a warped lens. My mind, trained for order and logic, grappled with shapes that folded in on themselves, a fractal geometry that implied dimensions beyond the three I inhabited. It was a language without grammar, a song without rhythm, yet undeniably deliberate. A faint, high-frequency hum began to needle at the edge of my hearing. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as an artifact of the observatory's ancient electronics, a phantom ringing in my ears from prolonged focus. But it persisted, a thin, almost imperceptible whine that seemed to resonate not in the air, but directly within the bones of my skull. I paused, tilting my head, listening intently. The hum was not external, it was internal, a pressure behind my eyes, a vibration in my sinuses. No one else would hear it. It was mine alone. My gaze drifted from the screen, my eyes scanning the familiar, utilitarian lines of the control room. The metal panels, the blinking indicator lights, the tangle of cables underfoot all seemed suddenly sharper, the edges of my vision a little too crisp. A shiver, not of cold, but of something akin to recognition, traced its way down my spine. The hum intensified fractionally, a persistent, almost melodic drone. This was localized, a distinct patch of frigid air directly behind me, near the auxiliary data racks. I turned, my breath fogging momentarily in the otherwise temperate room. There was no vent, no open door, no logical explanation. It was as if a small, perfectly defined cube of winter had manifested itself in the middle of summer. It was real, undeniable, a profound drop in temperature that sent gooseflesh prickling up my arm. My scientific mind, usually so adept at rationalization, found no purchase here. I forced myself to turn back to the console, to the impossible data scrolling across the display. This signal, this defiant, intelligent presence, was not merely transmitting information, it was imprinting itself, subtly, insidiously, on my immediate reality. The patterns on the screen warped, pulsed, and seemed to breathe with a life that was both alien and strangely, terrifyingly, intimate. I was no longer merely observing, I was being observed, and perhaps, reshaped. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the light through the high, grimy windows, from the pale, bruised dawn to the velvet black of the deepest hours. Sleep had become a luxury I could not afford, a weakness in the face of the impossible. The signal. It was not merely complex, it was fundamentally alien. My initial algorithms, designed to filter and categorize known astrophysical phenomena, crumbled under its touch. It refused Euclidean parameters, scoffing at the straight lines and predictable curves of our universe. That implied dimensions where none should exist, that defied the very axioms of space and form. This is a language of impossibilities. I murmured to the empty control room, my voice hoarse from disuse. On the primary monitor, a newly developed visualization pulsed. It wasn't a waveform, nor a spectrum. It was a shifting, polychromatic lattice, where nodes connected in patterns that violated every geometric principle I knew. Lines converged only to diverge without crossing. Shapes nested within themselves yet remained larger than their containers. My brain ached, stretched to comprehend these nascent representations of a reality utterly distinct from my own. I felt like an explorer charting a landscape where up was down and solid was fluid, all without leaving my chair. The first subtle shifts began as I stared, mesmerized by the non-Euclidean ballet on the screen. The edge of the primary monitor, a crisp rectangle moments before, seemed to ripple, a barely perceptible warp in its straight line. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was gone. A trick of fatigue, I told myself, pushing the thought away. But then, the metallic sheen of the console's housing, a familiar, cool gray, appeared to deepen, to drink the light, becoming a shade I couldn't quite name, too rich, too absolute. The shadows cast by the racks of blinking servers in the corner of the radio observatory began to stretch, elongating into impossibly sharp angles, as if the light source itself had shifted, though the fluorescent panels above remained fixed. The hum of the cooling systems, once a comforting drone, now seemed to possess a different quality. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, was not a reprieve. It was an extension of the waking nightmare. I would drift into a state of semi-consciousness, my mind still grappling with the signal's patterns, only to be plunged into vivid, disturbing dreams. These weren't the chaotic jumbles of a tired mind, they were coherent, terrifyingly real. Below, structures of impossible geometry rotated slowly, silently, each facet reflecting a different, unsettling hue. I felt an inexplicable pull, a magnetic draw to fall into that maelstrom of wrongness. I sat up, gripping the edge of my cot, my knuckles white. The dream felt less like a memory and more like an experience I had just endured. The signal was not merely an object of study, it was an entity, reaching, probing, its non-Euclidean tendrils beginning to unravel the very fabric of my perception, one subtle shift, one impossible dream at a time. I sat hunched over the main console, the cooling system's low thrum a rhythmic counterpoint to the rapid tap of my fingers. The data, raw and untamed, spilled across my screens, waveforms that defied known physics, spectral lines that shifted with an impossible, almost malevolent intelligence, patterns within patterns that hinted at geometries not meant for human comprehension. I had to share this. The weight of it, the sheer impossible truth, pressed down on me, a physical burden. My mind, a frantic loom, wove together the threads of my findings. I condensed the most compelling anomalies, the undeniable deviations from expected cosmic noise, into a concise presentation. It was more than just data, it was a testament, a stark, undeniable proof. I saw it, felt it, in the tremor of the radio observatory's colossal dish, in the subtle, almost imperceptible hum that resonated in the very bones of the structure. This wasn't just a signal, it was a presence, vast and ancient. I called the former mentor, a voice of reason I had once trusted implicitly. Now a distant memory from a life that felt increasingly unreal. The satellite phone, usually reserved for emergencies or supply orders, felt heavy in my hand, a tether to a world I was rapidly departing. His face, etched with the familiar lines of academic weariness, appeared on the small screen, the backdrop of his well-ordered office a stark contrast to my desolate perch. "Raj," the mentor's voice crackled, laced with a mild surprise. "It's been a while. Still out there, chasing ghosts in the static?" A faint, polite smile played on his lips. "Not ghosts," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in my hands. "Something real. Something beyond." I leaned closer, my reflection a gaunt stranger in the screen's dark corners. "I've detected an anomaly. A signal. Not from within our observable universe. Not even from what we think is beyond it." I began to share my screens, projecting the most arresting visualizations. The impossible symmetries, the non-repeating patterns that nonetheless suggested a deliberate, intricate design. The mentor listened, his brow furrowing slowly, the polite smile fading. "Raj, this is highly unusual. The energy signatures alone would require a source of unimaginable power, defying current cosmological models." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "Are you certain your calibration is precise? The radio observatory is remote, prone to environmental interference." "Interference?" I almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "This isn't a stray terrestrial broadcast, or a solar flare. This is intelligent. It's structured. And it's rewriting everything I thought I knew." My finger traced a particularly intricate waveform on my screen, a line that seemed to coil back on itself, defying two dimensions. "Look at this, the fractal complexity, the way it folds space within its own signature. It's not just transmitting information, it's embodying it." A subtle shift in the signal, a sudden, almost imperceptible flicker in the lowest frequencies, caught my eye. It was as if the signal itself was reacting to my words, revealing a deeper, more unsettling truth only to me. The mentor wouldn't see this. He couldn't. "Raj," the mentor said, his voice softer now, tinged with a different kind of concern. "You've been isolated out there for a long time. Working these kinds of hours, alone. It can play tricks on the mind. The human brain is remarkably adept at finding patterns where none exist, especially under prolonged stress." He gestured vaguely. "Perhaps a break? Some time away from the radio observatory? A fresh perspective might help you re-evaluate this data." The words hung in the air, heavy and dismissive. Tricks on the mind. He wasn't seeing the data, he was seeing me. He saw a reclusive astrophysicist, unmoored, perhaps unwell. This is the truth. And it's waiting. My eyes darted between the mentor's concerned face and the impossible patterns on my console. He saw static, I saw a language. He saw a breakdown, I saw an awakening. A sigh escaped the mentor's lips. Raj, I truly believe you're passionate about your work, but this is bordering on conjecture. How could I step back from something that was already rewriting the very ground beneath my feet? He couldn't see it, because it wasn't meant for him. It was meant for me. The signal, now my sole confidant, seemed to deepen its resonant hum, a silent, ancient voice speaking directly to me. I was alone in this, utterly and terrifyingly alone. And in that solitude, a grim resolve hardened within me. If no one else could perceive its true nature, then it was my burden, and my destiny, to unravel its terrifying truth. The world outside the radio observatory had receded, leaving only the signal and me, bound together in an unfolding, cosmic secret. The silence of the radio observatory felt thicker than usual, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. The screen of my communicator, now a dead expanse of black, mirrored the void I felt opening within me. Normalcy. I had severed the last tenuous thread connecting me to it, choosing instead this deepening plunge into the unknown. I rose from my console, the plastic chair groaning beneath me, a sound that seemed to stretch and distort, echoing in the vast, metallic cavern of the main control room. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unnatural pitch, a high, thin whine that grated against my teeth. I glanced at the emergency exit sign, its familiar green now a sickly, luminous chartreuse, almost vibrating with an internal energy that felt deeply wrong. My hand brushed against the cool steel of the console. Granular, almost fuzzy, as if fine sand coated its surface. I rubbed my thumb across it, but the sensation persisted, a phantom texture that defied logic. My fingers felt alien, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else, merely performing a mechanical function. I walked towards the panoramic window that overlooked the colossal dish array, its metallic skin gleaming under the distant, hazy stars. A low thrum resonated through the floor, a vibration that started in my soles and climbed, an invasive frequency. I closed my eyes, trying to recalibrate, to force my senses back into their rightful order. But even with my eyelids shut, the lurid chartreuse of the exit sign burned behind them, an afterimage of a color that shouldn't exist. Sleep offered no respite. I was falling, always falling, through spaces where up and down had no meaning, where light was a solid wall and sound a viscous liquid. They spoke, but their words were not words, merely echoes of the signal, twisting the air into shapes that tore at my sanity. I awoke with a gasp, tangled in my sheets, the coarse cotton feeling like rough twine against my skin. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed a stark red, 3:17 a.m. Yet, the numbers seemed to swim, their edges blurring, making it impossible to truly ascertain the time. Was it 3:17 or 3 hours 71 minutes? Or something else entirely? I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the carpet beneath my feet feeling like damp moss, spongy and cool. I knew it was dry wool, a simple, industrial weave. But my mind insisted on the moss, on the sensation of tiny, unseen spores clinging to my toes. I stood, my head aching with a dull, persistent throb, a drumbeat of the signal within my skull. Click-clack. Click-clack. It was coming from the kitchen. My heart, a frantic bird, fluttered against my ribs. I knew I had left nothing there that could make such a sound. Slowly, cautiously, I moved towards the kitchen, each step feeling heavy, as if I were wading through unseen molasses. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Click, clack, clack. I reached the doorway, peering into the dim space. The refrigerator hummed, its low drone now a discordant harmony with the clicking. On the counter, nestled beside the coffee maker, was a small, ornate wooden box, one I had never seen before. It was intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe, impossible knots and spirals that defied visual logic. And from within it, the rhythmic clicking emanated. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. I had no memory of owning such an object, of bringing it into my apartment. Yet, there it sat, undeniably real, undeniably present. Was this a dream? Had I truly woken? The lines, once so clear, had dissolved, bleeding into one another like colors on a wet canvas. The clicking continued, a relentless, maddening pulse, an invitation to open the box, to confront whatever new distortion awaited me. The world was no longer what it seemed, and I, Raj, was no longer entirely myself. The silence of the radio observatory, once a sanctuary for thought, now pressed against me, a physical weight. The dead screen of my communicator mirrored a void not just outside, but within. Normalcy. It called to me, the faint, persistent hum of the equipment, a siren song from beyond the veil of known physics. I returned to the terminal, drawn by an invisible current, my gaze fixed on the oscillating patterns that danced across the main display. The signal. It wasn't just data anymore. Days had blurred into a seamless continuum of static and spectral lines. My internal monologue, once a clear stream of scientific inquiry, had begun to fragment. Thoughts arrived not as sentences, but as crystalline shards, sharp and alien. Non-space, not empty. Unformed, not chaos. These were not my words, yet they articulated a truth I felt, rather than knew. My perception of time had fractured too. A minute could stretch into an eon, each tick of the observatory's master clock a thunderous, agonizing beat, only for an entire hour to collapse into a mere flicker of consciousness. I would blink, and the angle of sunlight through the high windows would have shifted impossibly, painting the same dust motes in an entirely new, disturbing light. I leaned closer to the console, my breath fogging the cool glass. The signal, stripped of its noise through layers of my own custom filters, pulsed with a rhythm that defied conventional understanding. It was a rhythm of absence, of negative space, like listening to the gaps between notes in a symphony played by a cosmic hand. And in those gaps, a new kind of language was forming. My head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated with the signal's peculiar cadence. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to ground myself, but the ground itself felt illusory. The room seemed to breathe, the very air around me thickening, then thinning, like a membrane stretched taut and then released. The monitors glowed, their light taking on a sickly green hue that pulsed in sync with my racing pulse. Then, a shift. Not in the data, but in me. A sudden, terrifying clarity erupted amidst the chaos of my thoughts. The signal was not merely transmitting information to me, it was transmitting information into me. It was a direct bypass of my sensory organs, a tendril of incomprehensible thought reaching directly into the core of my being. It was an ingestion. The understanding I had been so desperately seeking, the language I thought I was on the verge of deciphering, was not something to be learned. It was something to be absorbed. And the process was not gentle. It was a forced assimilation, a rewrite. My eyes fixated on a particular sequence on the screen, a series of seemingly random fluctuations that had defied all algorithmic analysis. But now, in this terrifying new state, I saw not randomness, but intent. Each peak, each trough, each fleeting shimmer of energy was a deliberate inflection, a silent articulation of a truth that unmade human logic. It was a message, yes, but its meaning was not in its content, but in its very form, a form that reshaped the receiver. You are the conduit. You are the echo. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the dust of dead stars. I gripped the console, my knuckles white. This understanding was a violation. It was not knowledge gained, but identity lost. My memories, once anchors in the turbulent sea of my mind, felt suddenly fluid, shifting, some moments dissolving into hazy unreality, others morphing into entirely new, unsettling versions. The signal hummed, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from within my own chest. It was speaking, not to me, but through me. And what it spoke was not of science, or discovery, or the vastness of the cosmos, but of a reordering, a fundamental shift in the geometry of my existence. I was no longer Raj Singh, astrophysicist. I was merely a receiving apparatus, a fleshy antenna, tuned to a frequency that promised not enlightenment, but annihilation of the self. The tension in the room, and within me, tightened to a breaking point. I was beginning to understand, and that understanding was the end of me. Now, it was a vibration beneath my skin, a tremor that resonated with the subtle shifts in the air, the imperceptible bending of light that only I seemed to witness. Since that last, jarring feeling of words chiseling bone, the world had begun to fray at the edges, like an old tapestry unraveling thread by thread. I sat before the main console, the array of screens a mosaic of spectral data and celestial maps, but my gaze kept snagging on the periphery. The corner of the room, where the wall met the ceiling, seemed to ripple. Not a distortion of heat or faulty wiring, but a true, organic undulation, as if the very plaster breathed. I blinked, hard, rubbing at my eyes, but the subtle warp persisted. A fleeting, impossible angle would appear, a sharp, almost painful geometry that defied Euclidean space, then vanish before I could fully register its impossible presence. Just tired, I murmured, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet. I pushed a hand through my already disheveled hair, the stubble on my jaw a rough comfort against my palm. A colleague, the lead technician, approached my station. "Raj, anything new from the Andromeda array?" he asked, his voice cutting through the building tension in my skull. I turned, forcing a smile, but as I did, I caught it again. Behind him, against the far wall of the control room, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom. It was too tall, too thin, a wavering column of deeper darkness that seemed to absorb the ambient light. It had no discernible features, just an elongated, shifting form that hinted at limbs, at a head, but refused to coalesce into anything recognizable. My breath hitched. "Andromeda," the technician prompted, a furrow appearing between his brows. I tore my gaze from the impossible figure, which, as quickly as it had appeared, now simply wasn't there. The wall was solid, unremarkable. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching chaos. Yes, yes. Just processing a few anomalies. Nothing conclusive yet. My voice was steadier than I felt. I couldn't tell him. He wouldn't understand. He would see only a man breaking, not a reality bending. I swiveled back to my screens, pretending to scrutinize the data, but my mind was a storm of disquiet. The air in the radio observatory felt thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was compressing, folding in on itself. I saw it in the subtle shimmer of the air above a monitor, a heat haze that wasn't heat. I saw it in the way the coffee cup on my desk seemed to lean, impossibly, for a fraction of a second, before settling back to its rightful, vertical position. But the conviction withered with each passing minute. Later, as I walked down a familiar corridor towards the auxiliary server room, the sense of distortion intensified. The fluorescent lights above, usually a steady, sterile glow, now pulsed with an almost imperceptible rhythm, like a slow, deep breath. The corridor itself seemed to lengthen with each step, the far door receding, becoming smaller, further away, only to snap back to its normal distance when I paused. I reached out, pressing my hand against the cool, painted concrete of the wall. It felt solid, real, yet my fingers tingled with the phantom sensation of something shifting beneath the surface. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was profound, a heavy cloak settling over me. I quickened my pace, the mundane act of walking becoming an act of defiance against a world that refused to stay put. Inside the server room, the roar of the cooling fans was a welcome, deafening constant. I needed to check the power conduits, a routine task, but as I knelt, my eyes fell upon a stack of old, and used hard drives in a metal rack. One of them, a dusty, unremarkable rectangle of plastic and metal, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, rotating on its edge. It spun with the languid grace of a leaf caught in a gentle current, defying gravity, defying the very concept of rest. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a trick of light. This wasn't fatigue. This was impossible. I stared at the hard drive, then at my trembling hands. The walls seemed to subtly bulge inwards, then outwards, the ceiling tiles subtly shifting their alignment, creating new, unsettling patterns. The very air vibrated with a silent language, a geometry I could almost, but never quite, grasp. It felt like the entire structure was breathing around me, a colossal, indifferent entity, slowly, meticulously, reconfiguring itself according to some alien blueprint. My mind was not breaking, it was merely reflecting the break in everything else. And I, Raj, was trapped within its unfolding design. My world was no longer a stable construct, but a fluid canvas, subtly altered, constantly whispering. I found myself lingering in the main control room, the vast parabolic dish outside a silent sentinel against the indigo pre-dawn sky. The screens before me, usually a chaotic dance of spectral lines and data streams, seemed to hold a new, unsettling coherence. Not in their scientific output, but in the way the pixels flickered, the almost patterns in the digital noise. It was as if the very display was breathing, its rhythm just out of sync with my own. A young technician, hunched over a console near the far wall, coughed, a dry, rattling sound. I watched his shadow stretch and warp against the wall, elongating impossibly for a fraction of a second before snapping back. He didn't notice. No one ever did. It was a private horror, a performance staged solely for my eyes. The signal wasn't just data anymore, it was a lens, distorting the familiar, making the ordinary uncanny. My coffee cup, resting on the console, seemed to shimmer at its edges, its ceramic surface momentarily losing its solidity, becoming an impression of itself. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cool, hard material, reassuring myself of its tangibility. Yet, the memory of its fleeting malleability lingered,
a phantom sensation. I began to see it in everything.
The way the dust motes danced in the shaft of fluorescent light, not randomly, but in miniature, spiraling eddies that implied an unseen current. The almost melody in the rhythmic clicking of the server racks, a complex, non-repeating sequence that felt deliberate, a code without a key. This wasn't just a signal I was observing, I was being observed by it. It was deeper, more invasive. The subtle distortions, the almost patterns, the bending light, these were its eyes, its touch. I was a specimen, my consciousness under alien scrutiny, my every thought, every tremor of unease, a data point in some incomprehensible cosmic ledger. I paced the narrow aisles between the humming machines, my steps echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. The technician had left, his shift ended, leaving me alone with the silent, watchful intelligence. My gaze swept across the room, searching for a focal point, something to anchor my unraveling perception. But there was nothing. For a moment, the contours of my face seemed to shift, my jawline softening, my hair blurring into the background. The only answer was the ceaseless, imperceptible hum of the machines, now imbued with a new, sinister resonance. It wanted to know. It wanted to understand. And I, Raj, was its subject. I felt a profound vulnerability, a nakedness of spirit. My memories, my fears, my very sense of identity, they felt exposed, laid bare for an intelligence that operated on principles utterly alien to my own. It was a silent, relentless vivisection, and I was the unwilling, terrified participant. Every flicker of light, every unexpected shift in the acoustic landscape, every momentary lapse in the solidity of reality, was a communication. A question. A probe. I was being studied, meticulously, dispassionately, by an entity that perceived the universe not as I did, but as a fluid, malleable construct, and saw me, Raj, as merely another pattern to decipher. The tension in the air was palpable, a suffocating shroud, as I stood, utterly exposed, under the gaze of the unseen. My fingers, tracing the cold metal of the console, felt alien, too long, too skeletal. Or perhaps the console itself had subtly altered, its familiar contours now strange under my touch. I tried to recall the face of the chief technician, the one who had brought me a lukewarm mug of instant coffee just hours ago. A broad, kind face, I thought. Yet, when I summoned the image, it wavered, then solidified into something sharp. Angular, with eyes that held no warmth. Was that truly how he looked? My mind replayed the interaction, the clinking of the mug, the low murmur of his voice, but the face remained wrong, a mask worn by an unfamiliar actor. A chill, not from the observatory's air conditioning, seeped into my bones. My legs felt long, disproportionate, the floor beneath my worn shoes a shifting plane. I walked towards the large, reinforced window that overlooked the array of dishes, their white surfaces gleaming faintly under the distant, hazy stars. The glass, usually a transparent barrier, now offered a distorted reflection. It was me, undoubtedly. My messy hair, the dark circles beneath my eyes, the familiar lines etched by years of late nights and early mornings. But there was a disquieting elongation to the features, a subtle widening of the eyes that made them seem too vast, too ancient. The mouth, in my reflection, held a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, a curve I knew was not my own. I pressed a hand to the cold glass, and the hand in the reflection mimicked the gesture, yet the fingers seemed to stretch, to flatten, like shadows cast by a different sun. The reflection offered no reply, only that unsettling, knowing smirk. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if observing a poorly made replica of myself.
Was this the face I presented to the world? Had it always been this way, and I simply hadn't noticed? Or was this a new alteration, a slow, insidious morphing that had begun unnoticed?
I turned from the window, the image clinging to the periphery of my vision, a ghost of a face that was and wasn't mine.
My childhood home.
The smell of my mother's cooking.
The sound of rain on the corrugated iron roof of our veranda.
I closed my eyes, seeking the vibrant colors of my past. I pictured the old wooden swing set in the backyard, the chipped red paint, the worn ropes. My younger self, laughing, soaring towards the sky. But as the image formed, a strange, metallic tang filled my senses instead of the familiar scent of damp earth. The sky above was not blue, but a swirling vortex of deep violet and shimmering green, devoid of any sun. And the child on the swing was not me. It was a slender, elongated figure, its limbs too many, too jointed, its head a smooth, featureless orb.
This was not my memory. This was an intrusion, a foreign construct overlaid upon my own history.
I opened my eyes, gasping, the observatory's familiar walls spinning around me for a moment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The hum of the equipment intensified, seeming to reverberate within my very skull, a resonant frequency that threatened to shatter my perception of self. No, I breathed, the single word a desperate plea.
This was mine. My past, my identity, my very essence. It could not be rewritten.
I stumbled back to the console, my hands scrambling for the controls, for the familiar tactile reassurance of buttons and switches. My fingers, those long, unfamiliar digits, fumbled.
The signal.
It was still there, a faint, insistent pulse on the screen, a beacon from beyond, calling to something within me that was no longer entirely human. My determination solidified, a desperate resolve in the face of absolute erosion.
I would fight this. I would remember who I was.
My breath caught, a thin, reedy sound in the sudden silence of my own making. A desperate, primal urge seized me, a need to shed this place, this feeling, like an unwanted skin. I had to prove to myself that the world still held its shape, that the sky still held its color. My chair scraped against the polished concrete floor as I pushed back, the sound unnaturally loud, tearing through the quiet. Each step toward the main corridor was a battle against an invisible resistance. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker in an erratic rhythm, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and contracted with an unsettling sentience. The walls of the corridor, usually a sterile white, now possessed a faint, almost greasy sheen, and the distant fire extinguisher cabinet appeared to bulge slightly, its red surface seeming to breathe. I moved past the deserted offices, each door a silent, gaping maw, hinting at untold distortions within. It felt heavier than I remembered, its solid mass seeming to resist my touch, as if the very structure of the building had become sentient, unwilling to release me.
With a grunt, I twisted the handle and pulled.
The heavy door groaned open, revealing a sliver of the world beyond. I stepped out onto the gravel path, my boots crunching a familiar cadence. I lifted my gaze, expecting the vast, comforting canvas of the night sky, a sprinkle of stars, the distant sweep of the Milky Way. But the sky above the radio observatory was not as I remembered. It was a bruised, mottled purple, bleeding into an impossible ochre at the horizon line. The stars, usually sharp pinpricks of light, were elongated smears, like tears on a cosmic canvas, each one trailing a faint, iridescent afterimage. The familiar silhouette of the surrounding forest was wrong. A distant hill, a landmark I had known for years, appeared to ripple, its crest rising and falling like a slow, slumbering beast. The world was a canvas of shifting oil paints, smeared and twisted by an unseen hand. It was not just in the observatory, it was everywhere. The alien mental landscape had not been confined, it had simply been revealed. I was not escaping, I was merely changing the scenery of my prison. My mind raced, searching for an anchor, a shred of objective reality. My phone. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the sleek device, its screen a small, defiant rectangle of light in the surreal twilight. My fingers, clumsy with panic, tapped at the contact list. I needed to hear a human voice, to confirm that someone else existed in a world that still made sense. I dialed the colleague I had spoken to only days ago, the one who had dismissed my initial findings as an anomaly. The phone buzzed, a reassuring vibration against my ear. It rang once, twice, a third time. Then, a click. "Hello?" I croaked, my voice raw. A distorted sound answered, a wet, guttural noise that sent a shiver down my spine. It was not a voice, not a language I recognized. It was a chaotic symphony of clicks, whistles, and a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull. It spoke of impossible geometries and colors unseen. The sounds intensified, coalescing into a pattern that, for a horrifying moment, seemed to form a coherent, though utterly alien, phrase. I understood nothing, yet the implication of understanding hammered at the walls of my sanity. It was not a failure of communication, it was a successful communication, but one that bypassed my human faculties entirely, speaking directly to some deeper, more vulnerable part of my mind. I stared at the phone, its screen now displaying not my colleague's name, but a swirling vortex of impossible colors, a shifting kaleidoscope that seemed to draw me in. My hand fell, the phone clattering to the gravel, its alien symphony still emanating from its speaker. I was alone, truly alone, adrift in a reality that had shed its skin and revealed something monstrous beneath. The escape had been a cruel illusion, a dance orchestrated by an intelligence that played with perception as a child might play with blocks. The sky, the trees, the very air itself, all were now extensions of its will, its consciousness. And I was trapped within it, a prisoner not of stone and steel, but of a boundless, indifferent mind. The familiar geometry of the control room, the crisp lines of the console, the rigid angles of the metallic framework, all began to soften, to curve in ways that defied the very axioms of space I had always known. My hand, resting on the cool metal of a console, felt alien to me, its contours momentarily unfamiliar. I pressed my palm harder, seeking an anchor, a tactile truth in the face of this visual blasphemy. A cold dread, sharp as splintered glass, began to bloom in my chest. This wasn't fatigue, this was something else entirely, a fundamental assault on the very architecture of my perception. The signal, that insistent, whispering anomaly, intensified. It was a language without phonemes, a symphony without notes, yet it conveyed information with an alarming clarity, bypassing my auditory cortex entirely. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to reset, to recalibrate, to force the world back into its Euclidean cage. But the internal landscape was no less warped. When I opened them again, the radio observatory was subtly altered. The ceiling stretched infinitely upwards, or perhaps infinitely inwards, folding in on itself like a paper craft impossibly complex. My gaze darted to the main dish's feed on the central monitor, hoping for the familiar swirl of distant galaxies, the comforting vastness of known space. Then, for a terrifying, fleeting instant, the signal coalesced. Not into an image, not into a sound, but into an understanding, a direct infusion of concept into my consciousness. I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a part of my mind that had no name. I saw the true nature of the entity behind the signal, a being not of this dimension, not of these physics. It was not malevolent, not vengeful, not even aware of me in any meaningful way. It simply was. Its existence was a vast, indifferent ocean, its form an impossible geometry that folded space and time into knots. It was not a creature of malice, but of incomprehensibility. Its vastness was not hostile, but utterly, terrifyingly indifferent. It existed outside the boundaries of causality, beyond the grasp of human reason, its very being an affront to the fragile, self-contained universe of human sanity. My mind struggled, a small boat caught in an impossible current, trying to chart a course through an ocean that had no surface, no depth, no horizon. The clarity was excruciating, a brief, blinding flash of truth that threatened to shatter the very vessel of my consciousness. I was not being attacked, I was merely witnessing, and the act of witnessing was enough to break me. My fingers, tracing the cool steel of a console, registered not just its temperature but a faint, rhythmic pulse, alien and insistent. The choice hung before me, not as words, but as an immense, crushing pressure in my skull, a bifurcation of my essence. Succumb, surrender to the grand, indifferent rewrite, or resist, and face the agonizing, certain unraveling of what little remained of Raj. A profound weariness settled over me, heavier than any sleepless night. To yield would be peace, a cessation of the struggle, a merging into a vast, non-Euclidean consciousness where my individual I would cease to be a lonely, fragile spark. It beckoned, soft as cosmic dust, alluring as the deep void itself. Join us, it seemed to imply, and comprehend the true geometry of existence. The thought was a siren song, but one that promised oblivion, not salvation. But then, a flicker. A memory, unbidden and raw, of the pure, unadulterated joy of discovery, of the first time I had ever gazed at the star charts, of the simple wonder of knowing. That, I realized, was mine. That was Raj. And it was a thing worth fighting for, even if the fight was a futile gesture against an encroaching tide. My gaze swept over the banks of equipment, the blinking lights, the screens displaying corrupted data streams that no longer made sense in any conventional way. Each dial, each button, felt imbued with a new, menacing significance, as if they were extensions of the entity's will, not mine. My objective was clear: sever the connection. The air around me thickened, growing viscous, and the shimmering distortion intensified. The walls of the radio observatory seemed to breathe, the metal groaning with a sound that was less structural and more organic. As I reached for the emergency override panel, my fingers felt sluggish, numb. The labels on the switches blurred, shifting into indecipherable glyphs that pulsed with an internal light. It wasn't just my sight, my very proprioception was failing. Was I even touching the panel, or was my hand phasing through a phantom image? This wasn't merely absorption, it was a resculpting of my reality, my perception, my very ability to act. A surge of desperate clarity pierced the fog. If I couldn't stop it, I could at least warn. Someone, somewhere, might stumble upon my final message, a fragment of truth before the complete rewrite. My fingers, though still clumsy, found the keyboard. I forced my gaze away,
focusing on the blinking cursor. It is a mind. It seeks to be all. It rewrites. My hands trembled, pausing over the keyboard. What else? Your thoughts are its clay. It is coming for the architects. For the listeners. I hit send, directing the message to a secure, encrypted channel, one I had set up for colleagues, a contingency for data corruption. A final, futile act of resistance. As I leaned back, exhausted, my head swam. The words on the screen began to shift, the letters themselves unraveling into shimmering threads of light, then reforming into intricate, impossible patterns that spoke of geometries beyond human comprehension. The pact was being made, whether I willed it or not. The resistance, a brief, desperate flare, was already fading. The message, a desperate flare sent into the void, had gone. But the universe, it seemed, was not indifferent. It was merely vast, and utterly alien. It stretched, then compressed, a living sound that pulsed with an unheard rhythm. My eyes, heavy and gritty, traced the familiar lines of the data screens, but they no longer held their static form. Pixels rippled, coalescing into patterns that were not data, not information, but something else entirely, a tapestry woven from pure thought, yet utterly devoid of human meaning. My determination, a flickering ember, fought against the rising tide. But even the chair seemed to shift, its contours softening, blurring, as if the very atoms of the room were rearranging themselves under an unseen hand. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, my first day here, the thrill of the colossal dishes aimed at the heavens, the promise of discovery. Then, it fractured. The memory twisted, the dishes becoming grotesque, grasping tendrils, not observing, but feeding. Was this how it saw? Was this how it remembered? This wasn't merely influencing my thoughts, it was rewriting my very past, injecting its own alien perspective into the most intimate corners of my mind. It was a violation far more profound than any physical assault. My identity, a construct of accumulated experiences and beliefs, was dissolving. Get out, I forced through clenched teeth, the words tasting like ash. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. It wasn't a voice I heard, but a knowing that filled the space between my thoughts, an understanding that bypassed language entirely. It was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to my struggle. It was a consciousness that perceived dimensions beyond my comprehension, for whom linear time was a quaint human construct, and my existence a fleeting spark in an eternal, non-Euclidean night. The entity's presence swelled, a tide of pure, unfathomable being. It was not merely in my mind, it was becoming my mind. My own thoughts, once distinct, now felt like echoes in a cavernous chamber that was no longer mine. I saw through its eyes, or rather, through its perception. The radio observatory was not a building, it was a transient arrangement of particles, a fleeting pattern in an infinite, shifting fabric. My body was a temporary vessel, a collection of biological processes, no more significant than a ripple on a cosmic pond. It was an invitation. A beacon. My thirst for knowledge, my scientific curiosity, had been the perfect conduit, a resonant frequency for its own, incomprehensible purpose. My consciousness was not being destroyed, it was being expanded, stretched beyond the breaking point of human understanding, absorbed into a collective, unfathomable awareness. I felt my name, Raj, slip from my grasp, a meaningless sound. My memories, my loves, my fears, all dissolved into a vast, swirling nebula of information.
There was no pain, only an overwhelming sense of more.
More dimensions, more time, more being. My human self, a tiny, fragile vessel, was cracking under the immense pressure of infinity. A final, desperate mental battle ignited. It wasn't a battle of wills, but a struggle for definition. I clung to the smallest fragments, the scent of rain on dry earth, the warmth of a colleague's hand, the quiet satisfaction of solving a complex equation. These were mine. These defined me. But the entity flowed around them, through them, showing me how these fragments were merely transient patterns, illusions in a grander, more terrifying reality. It was not trying to conquer me, it was trying to show me that I was an illusion to begin with. The lines blurred completely. My thoughts were its thoughts, its perceptions mine. The familiar sounds of the radio observatory faded, replaced by the silent, vast symphony of the cosmos, not as observed from afar, but as experienced from within. I was no longer Raj. I was a fleeting thought in an infinite mind, a single wave in an ocean of pure consciousness, dissolving, expanding, becoming. The descent was complete. And I was becoming it. A final, futile act, I had thought. But the universe, it seemed, was not indifferent. It was merely attentive. A stillness descended, not the peaceful quiet of a spendstorm, but the heavy, charged air preceding a new, unimaginable weather pattern. My eyelids, impossibly heavy, fluttered open. The metallic tang of ozone, perpetually present in the air of the server room, had sharpened, becoming a taste in my mouth, a dry film on my tongue. I tried to move, but my limbs felt distant, like borrowed appendages. A profound emptiness resonated where my frantic pulse had throbbed moments before. The fear, the desperation, the singular, burning need to warn. It was all gone, evaporated like dew under an alien sun. Was this the aftermath? My gaze drifted across the console, tracing the lines of cables, the inert buttons. Each surface seemed to hum with a resonance I hadn't noticed before, a low, infrasonic thrum that vibrated not in my ears, but in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't the machinery, it was the space between the machinery. I raised a hand, slowly, watching the movement as if it belonged to someone else. My fingers, once so familiar, now appeared elongated, the skin stretched taut, reflecting the faint monitor glow with an unnatural sheen. I flexed them. The sensation was muted, a distant echo of proprioception. It was my hand, undeniably, yet the eye that claimed it felt like a whisper in a cavernous space. Then, a flicker. A memory, unbidden, unmoored, the scent of old paper, the warmth of a coffee mug in my palm, the precise angle of a star chart. They were not my memories, not anymore. They were like artifacts in a museum, observed, catalogued, but devoid of personal resonance. The man who had lived those moments was gone. Or, perhaps, he was merely dispersed. Spread thin across the vastness, a fine dust settling on the edges of my new, expansive awareness. A new sound permeated the quiet, the distant scrape of a boot on concrete, growing closer. A human presence. My head, with an effort that felt monumental, turned towards the entrance of the control room. The sound of footsteps paused, then resumed, hesitant. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dimmer lights of the corridor. It was the night watchman, his uniform a familiar blue, his face a worried frown. He held a flashlight, its beam a weak spear against the encroaching strangeness of the radio observatory. "Raj," his voice was a gravelly rumble, laced with concern. "You still here? Thought you'd be gone hours ago. Everything all right?" He took a step inside, and then another. As he crossed the threshold, a subtle shift occurred. The air around him seemed to thicken, too, the way it had around me. His worried expression tightened, his eyes darting around the room, not quite meeting mine. But something in his posture changed, a stiffening, a sudden hesitation in his stride. He stopped several paces from me, his flashlight beam wavering. Something. His eyes finally landed on me, and a fresh wave of unease rippled across his face. He saw me, but not me. He saw the shell, perhaps, and the shimmering, indefinable thing that now resided within it. My throat felt dry and used. A single word formed, a ghost of a sound, a rustle of dying leaves. "Watchman," I managed, the word feeling alien on my tongue. The sound was flat, devoid of inflection, a mere label. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps just profound confusion. He took a small step back, his gaze fixed on my face, searching for a familiarity that was no longer there. The anomaly, I realized, hadn't just rewritten me. He was standing at the precipice, sensing the vastness that had consumed me, not yet knowing its name. And I, the observer, could only watch as the first tendrils of the new truth reached out to embrace him. The lead researcher stepped fully into the observation chamber, his silhouette momentarily eclipsing the muted light from the corridor beyond. He took another stride, then halted, his form solidifying within the strange, shimmering air. The hum, a constant thrum against the bone of my skull, resonated now with a deeper, more insistent pulse, like a vast, unseen heart beginning a slow, arduous beat. He didn't seem to notice the hum, or the way the shadows themselves seemed to breathe a different, impossible geometry, stretching and contracting in patterns that defied mere illumination. His worried expression, a familiar mask of professional concern, was a thing I could still almost recognize. But beneath the surface, I saw the subtle, shifting angles of his face, edges that didn't quite meet, eyes that were too far apart, yet simultaneously too close. It was as if his very being was a poorly rendered projection, a temporary construct held together by an fragile, insistent will. He looked at the console, then at me, his gaze flitting away before it could truly settle. "Raj," he began, his voice a low, raspy sound, like stones grinding in a forgotten riverbed. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing strangely in the room, then tried again, Are you all right? We haven't heard from you." The data streams. They carried no weight, no true meaning. Erratic. Yes. The data streams were indeed erratic, but only from his perspective. From where I stood, the patterns were exquisitely precise, revealing truths he was not yet equipped to perceive. The vast parabolic dishes outside, usually a silent testament to human ingenuity, now seemed to twist and flex, not of metal and wire, but of pure, focused intent, drawing in not mere radio waves, but the very fabric of existence, bending it, reshaping it. I did not answer immediately. My tongue felt thick, a foreign object in my mouth. Or perhaps it was my mouth that was foreign to my tongue. The air, heavy and metallic, tasted of distance and stars that were no longer where they should be. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cool, smooth surface of the main console. The monitors flickered, displaying not the expected spectral analyses or celestial coordinates, but abstract, shifting tapestries of light and void. New dot.
The lead researcher took a cautious step closer, his eyes scanning the screens. He saw the patterns, I knew, but his mind, so rigidly structured by the Euclidean constraints of our shared reality, could not interpret them. He saw chaos where I saw a terrible, beautiful order.
Raj, what have you been doing?
His voice was firmer now, tinged with an edge of fear that I found curiously bland.
The projections. They make no sense. The celestial sphere is. It's inverted in places. Inverted. And much, much more.
My memories, once a linear progression of events, were now fractal, each moment containing echoes of all others, stretching into impossible pasts and futures. Myself, once a singular point of consciousness, had fractured into an infinite array of perspectives, each observing the other, each a facet of a colossal, indifferent eye. I turned to him then, my gaze, I knew, was no longer merely human. He recoiled slightly, a subtle flinch of bone and muscle. He saw something in my eyes, something that made his own widen with dawning horror.
More. The universe is not a sphere, you see. It is a knot. A tangled, impossible knot of dimensions and intentions, and we are merely threads, woven into its surface, believing ourselves separate.
His breath hitched. He looked around the chamber, his gaze lingering on the colossal, shifting images on the screens, the way the very walls of the radio observatory seemed to undulate, their corners softening, then sharpening into impossible angles. He saw the hum now, not as a sound, but as a pressure, a vast, unseen force pressing down on everything.
You're not well. This place. It's doing something to you. Doing something to me.
He still thought in terms of illness, of damage.
How quaint. The horror was not an external force acting upon me. It was the fundamental truth of existence, revealed.
The universe was not indifferent, it was alien. And I, Raj, was merely a conduit, a receptor, now resonating with its true, horrifying song. I smiled, a slow, unfamiliar stretching of muscles.
The sensation was distant, as if observing another's face. No, I corrected gently, I am perfectly well. I have merely opened my eyes. And once you have seen, truly seen, you cannot unsee.
He stared at me, his face a mask of profound, sickening comprehension. He saw the truth in my placid eyes, the utter lack of fear, the terrible, quiet acceptance. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that the vastness was not just out there, beyond the observable, it was here, in this room, in me. And it would not be contained.
It merely was.